Discover the amazing, clinically proven health benefits of original Tahitian noni. Original Tahitian noni includes powerful antioxidants, adaptogens, nutrients, and phytonutrients to naturally boost energy levels, immune system function, and overall health. Meticulously sourced from French Polynesia, this is the original superfruit. Accept no imitations. Original Tahitian noni. Visit ATR Health at alchemicaltechrevolution.com. and click on the Shop Here tab for more details.
But we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
Listening to the Alchemical Tech Revolution, and I am your host, Wayne McRoy. Good evening, good morning, wherever you are around the world tonight. We're going to continue our look at the notion of the secret invasion, and this is part 2, talking about something that we dropped in the first episode here, the Collins Elite. You may have heard of this group. And according to some insiders, like one Mr. Luis Elizondo, this Collins Elite seems to have set up shop within the auspices of the intelligence agencies, within what you would call the deep state, and within the operations and the innermost sanctums of the military-industrial complex. Now, who exactly is this Collins Elite? We referenced this in the last episode, when we were talking about all of this recent sighting of drones in the skies all around the world, what they're calling mystery drones, the UAP phenomenon, the UFO phenomenon. We see all different weird things happening in the skies, and we've related it back, in some instances, to the intelligence agencies. And we looked at and explored what it is that the UFO research community is saying about this and how they are claiming that there's inside government programs, and this is all coming to light in Congress and other places, reverse engineering programs and different things like that that are claimed to be going on. And at the core of a lot of this, there's a secretive cabal that operates outside the oversight of Congress and the United States government, operates through the auspices of different black budget programs, using corporations as a mask or shield to hide their innovations that they are making in technological advances in supposedly reverse engineering some of these technologies. And at the core of this is this group, referenced by Luis Elizondo and others as the Collins Elite. Well, what can we know about this Collins Elite? And much of this draws back on some research that was put forward back in the late 80s and early 90s by a guy named Fritz Springmeier, whose book detailing this, by the way, is actually on the CIA's own website. You can find a free PDF download of this book, The Elite Bloodlines of the Illuminati, on the CIA's website by Fritz Springmeier. So we're going to look into that a little bit tonight, to talk about and see who exactly is it that is being referenced here when we're talking about the Collins Elite and how it's actually morphed into a kind of mythology of its own here in the modern era within the UFO research community. Now, I've heard other people speak on this before, and certainly we would all agree that there seems to be some type of a breakaway civilization or a Fourth Reich or some such thing that operates centrally within the auspices of the military-industrial complex and makes up what you would call the deep state or the shadow government or something like that, an extra-national organization that doesn't seem to have any bounds as far as nationality or any type of influence of sovereignty or anything like that as far as nation states and things like that go. So it knows no loyalties beyond itself, and it interpenetrates into all the various government agencies and organizations around the world, especially the intelligence community. So what is this? Where did it come from? And why this one special name for this group that seems to be associated with these technological innovations surrounding what we would call UFO technology? Well, we're going to get into that tonight. We're going to look at what it is that is known here about this Collins elite, which that is a name, the Collins family. And you'll see there's some pretty interesting ideas attached to this Collins family bloodline as we go through this, and we're going to actually cross over into something a little bit different later on with this, because all of these things always connect back to the occult. And we'll touch on that as we get there. So the first thing to know here is Fritz Springmeier. He says that one of the most famous Collinses in the era in which he began writing this was Joan Collins, and I'm sure you've heard of Joan Collins. Well, he says Joan Collins was what you would call a light connection to this Collins elite family. She didn't have any direct involvement in some of the insider things that go on with it, but she had that connection because of the family name, and she was famous for that reason. But she also was known to have associated with a long list of what Fritz Springmeier identifies as key Illuminati men, and at least a few known Satanists. But this is only the barest of dues that she might have anything to do with the Illuminati herself. So now Mr. Springmeier goes into what he calls some of the hard connections first. And he says here, the following is a description of a highly secret, high-level satanic meeting. It comes via an ex-insider who is now a Christian. If any other ex-hierarchy person is reading this, perhaps this will trigger some memories for you. This experience dates back to 1955. This is a meeting that is held twice yearly, and to which the Rothschilds and all the Mother families attend. The meeting is inside in a big room, and the grandmother on the throne was a Collins. The Collins family had been kept out of the limelight because they have more occult power than the Rothschilds or Rockefellers. To make money, this Collins family does something financially, such as deal with the exchange of money. Now, Springmeier continues, and he says that he's noticed that numerous Collinses have been insurance executives, and although he hasn't exposed the connections between insurance companies and the NWO, there is a book out which shows how the most insurance companies are connected and under the guidance of the NWO New World Order elite. The grandmother, Collins, dressed in black, has an ebony and gold moon-shaped throne that she can automatically rotate by pushing a pedal with her foot. Behind her sits the Grand Council with 13 members. This might be or might not be the Grand Druid Council that you will read about further on. The difference between this council in 1955 is that it was all males, while the council in 1978 has several women on it. The grandmother, a Collins woman, was thought to be in her mid-50s at the time of this meeting. She had a deep dictatorial voice, was small in stature, and was very powerful. She was decked out on her throne with a great deal of jewelry. One of the first things done was to lay before her feet small gold bricks, shaped like small gold bricks and made of pure gold. 2 boys who were taken to be her sons, one of whom was Tom Collins. Tom was later gunned down by the Illuminati, it says here in parentheses, were near her throne. As only the most honored and powerful dared to be in the vicinity of her throne, this showed that these 2 Collins boys were powerful. The boys passed out papers which had timetables written on them of things that were to happen. A great discussion was carried on about what had happened in the world to bring in Satan's one-world government during the last 6 months and what was prepared to happen in the near future. Things that had not gone according to plan were discussed. The Ark of the Covenant was discussed, where it was hidden in Africa, and a ritual mocking the Ark of the Covenant was held. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. Now, as always, with a lot of this stuff, I do always caution you to take it with a grain of salt. We can't prove nor disprove any of this. This is said by Springmeier to be the testimony of an ex-Satanist or somebody who was involved with this Illuminati group who came out of that group and became a Christian and confessed to this stuff that they witnessed allegedly in 1955. And he's giving some context here about the things he discovered from talking to some of these alleged insiders. Now, like I said, you can't prove nor disprove this. So this, in and of itself, cannot be taken at face value as it is. But these are some of the things and the notions that have been discussed about this Collins family or this Collins elite group. And I do suspect there may be some elements of truth to this. And of course, you're getting Mr. Springmeier's inherent biases, his personal biases, in a lot of this. He is describing these people as Satanists. Now, is that necessarily the case? I don't know if they view themselves as such or not, or had at that point viewed themselves as such or not. I don't have all the answers to that, but these are the claims that he has made. And these are the claims that have been made by others who had allegedly been involved in some of these programs, had been abused, had been put through the satanic ritual abuse, SRA as it is called, and came forward later to testify their memories of what had happened. So you get very similar stories from a lot of different sources that don't really know one another and don't have a connection to one another. So I suspect there may be some true elements to some of this, but it's very difficult to make those assertions based upon just these testimonies. So that being the case, we'll proceed here with caution and just keep in mind what Mr. Springmeier's personal biases were in this case and what things he thought to be true at the time of the writing of this, and maybe how he's describing these things might be a little different from what they were, but rest assured, there's ritualism involved, and there's dark occultism and dark magic involved in these very things that are being described here, and it does not escape the realm of possibility that this happens at the highest, most levels of power. In fact, I'm almost certain that it does. We've seen too much circumstantial evidence to point to stuff like this going on. So, with that being the case, we will proceed here and keep all that in mind. Fritz Meyer continues and he says, 7 children in white were brought in from generational satanic families and presented before the grandmother Collins. They laid prostrate in worship of her. She would move her scepter with a snake up and down, striking the floor, to show approval of a child candidate. The 7 other children were sacrificed for the 7 approved children, one for each child, whose name would then be written with a quill using the sacrificed child's blood. The children were given oaths. The grandmother rotated her throne and faced the Council of 13 and declared, speaking in English, quote, "This is tomorrow's generation, a chosen few," end quote. The John the Baptist of the Antichrist put in an appearance, but the Antichrist at that time was not born or only a tiny baby. Now, this is where Springmeier's personal biases come in once again, and he makes some assertions here and asks some questions. So he asks the question, was this Benjamin Creme? And if you're not familiar with who Benjamin Creme is or was, I think he's still alive. I think he's still out there. He's a heavy promoter of a lot of New Age nonsense, and he is said to be the forebearer of the one they call the Maitreya, who claims to be the Messiah in the modern age. And a lot of this has been attached to this New Age nonsense that goes on. And nothing much has ever come of this. Now, this falls into the category of the Theosophists, if I remember correctly. This is what the Theosophists were looking for, because this guy claims to be from the Great White Brotherhood. And it's all very interesting, but it's all very hokey and New Age nonsense. Nothing has ever shaken out from this, but this was a popular notion back at the time when Springmeier was looking at this. They thought maybe this guy was the Antichrist. And this Benjamin Creme was the forerunner of the Antichrist, the one crying out in the wilderness, much like John the Baptist, who, if you understand the language of symbology here, is a very important and central figure to many of the secret society groups. So I suspect all of this New Agey type nonsense regarding Maitreya and Benjamin Creme's role in all of this as the type of prototypical John the Baptist here is all just symbolism representing something else, not the literal Antichrist in that view. But certainly, we could see this. This is the lens of observation that Springmeier had at the time. This was his personal bias coming in, and what he knew and understood based upon Christian theology and what he had heard from insiders from these Illuminati families and those who were affected by the satanic ritual abuse that went on at that time, or at least that's what they claimed or alleged. But let's continue here. So he says the ex-insider didn't learn the name of this John the Baptist, forerunner of the Antichrist. However, the descriptions of this occult John the Baptist do match Benjamin Creme. Benjamin Creme was born in 1924 and was deeply into the occult and witchcraft even when he was a boy. He claims that in 1959 he telepathically received a message from his master, a member of the hierarchy, and it says in parentheses, demonic hierarchy. Creme calls these master spirits simply the hierarchy. Christians know it as the demonic hierarchy. Because all these things are planned out well in advance, it would have been very appropriate if Creme had been at a high-level planning meeting in 1955. So I'm going to pause for a moment. So now on this point, Springmeier is speculating that this alleged witness that came out and made these claims about this meeting in 1955, that maybe this figure that they named as being there was Benjamin Creme, based upon, well, what his observations were. And that's about it, but it is purely speculation. So maybe there's something to it and maybe there's not. Let's read on and see. For more understanding on Creme's Christ, the reader is directed to read the article on the Sufis in this newsletter, which he's referring back to a former newsletter that he wrote. And wherein in that newsletter he says that it refers back to the gold bricks laid before the grandmother's throne. And there are several reasons that real gold is important to the Illuminati. Perhaps in some of the other articles that the newsletter that he was publishing at the time he would get into it, but I don't know if he ever did or not. So then he goes to name some other information here. In his January 1st, 1993 newsletter, the names of many top Illuminati are given. One that could have been included is Robert Moore Collins, who was born in 1867, and he's not quite sure when he died, who was a member of the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims, or the Pilgrim Society. You may have heard of this, maybe you haven't. But he says they are 60 of the modern equivalent of the Bavarian Illuminati. Robert M. Collins was a reporter for several important newspapers and worked as an editor in the Washington and New York offices of the Associated Press. He did chiefly political work for the Associated Press. He was the chief newsman for Reuters, and, of course, Springmeier points out in parentheses here that it is an Illuminati-controlled press. Well, I have news for you, Mr. Springmeier. A full 95% of all news media is controlled by what you would call the Illuminati. You see, these insiders, they control just about all of the information outlets that we have. Very small percentage are not controlled in some way, shape, or form. And sadly, those of us that aren't in their big club, well, we get heavily censored and shadow banned. So very few people actually hear our voices, but that's beside the point. But he says the Associated Press had many stories from this guy coming out of the Orient. Although he was born in Washington, D.C., his address as an adult became Bournemouth, England. He never married. As those who investigate the Illuminati find out, the Illuminati control the press. No kidding. Here was a man who helped to do it for them. And he says about his last newsletter, one of his newsletters that he wrote here prior to publishing this, he went into a little more detail about how important some of the various organizations were, particularly one that he referred to as the Satanic Societas Rosicruciana, is in relation to satanic groups such as the OTO, the Golden Dawn, and the Stella Matutina. The Societas Rosicruciana is definitely a high-level exclusive Illuminati organization. One of the New York SR officers was James F. Collin, 8th degree, who died April 2nd, 1896. He was with the original set of the Societas Rosicrucianas, officers of the First High Council of the SR in America, which had oversight over all the SR colleges or lodges in America. His position was called presenter, and Springmeier tells us he doesn't really know what that officer does. When the Canadians set up a Societas Rosicruciana in Canada, the High Council, which had oversight over all Canada, included a Collins on its council, and his name was Daniel Collins, 8th degree. Daniel Collins had several positions on the council. The highest degree is the 9th degree in that system. If you've read this newsletter that he did previously, or his book called Be Wise as Serpents, you have come across the Grand Druid Council. This is a high-level Illuminati council. In Be Wise as Serpents, in the second section, in a chapter entitled Heresy Interlocks with Power, on the 8th page, Springmeier gives the names of people who were on this secret Grand Druid Council in the spring of 1978. Each of these people are powerful witches and have a great deal of power in the world. Going to pause for a moment here, folks. So I don't know specifically if this Grand Druid Council is the chief core of power today, but this was the allegation made by Springmeier. They had a lot of influence, and I suspect that it still has a lot of influence, and it may go by other names. See, this is the thing. They always move around the inner circle within the inner circle to various positions and locations and different groups and names in order to disguise the function of what you would call the Illuminati. It is the inner circle within the inner circle that interlocks at the topmost levels of all these various secret society groups. It's ever present, and it changes names over the course of time. But he's saying, as of 1978, this Grand Druid Council was where a lot of the centrality of power resided. And it had connections to the various Rosicrucian orders here in America. Now remember, when Springmeier wrote this back in the early 1990s, this stuff wasn't anywhere near as well known as it is now to conspiracy-minded people who research this and look for this information. This was a whole lot of research that this guy put in, a whole lot of hard work and effort trying to find the different connections, pouring through books and libraries the old-fashioned way, because the internet was in its infancy at that time, and this information was not readily available. This information could not be found outside of the auspices of a good Masonic library or some such publishing house or organization like that. So you had to work really hard to find some of these connections and some of this information. And he put a lot of effort into this. And he got a lot of pushback. And the guy actually did a lengthy prison sentence for something he claims he didn't do. But I don't know the full scope of it. But he definitely has been silenced in recent years. I haven't heard much of a peep from him in recent years. Every once in a while he'll show up on the talk show circuit somewhere in the conspiratorial community, and he might go over some of the old information and might go over what happened to him and how he wound up in prison, but he doesn't seem to really push the envelope these days. Now, back in the early 1990s, he was putting a lot of this information out there, and I don't think there were a lot of people in positions of power that were very happy with the guy. Let's put it that way. Because he connected the dots. He presented this information to people, and I don't think people at that time were quite ready for this yet. And that's a lot of the problem. Even today, there's still people that aren't ready to hear about these secret organizations, these secret societies, these occult fraternities that do exist, and they have interpenetrated throughout all different levels of society, and they do wield a lot of worldly power. People aren't comfortable to think in that way. And a lot of this is by design, because they've hidden themselves behind the veil of secrecy, but that veil is being torn away as we are in the time of revelation now. And things that were once done in the dark, in secret, are now coming to the light of day and being exposed for what they are. Now, Springmeier was one of the early pioneers of doing this, but the masses weren't ready yet, and I suspect some still aren't. Now, he tried primarily to expose a lot of this to the Christian churches. And as you may or may not know, many of the Christian churches, the mainstream churches, have been infiltrated by these doctrines presented by the secret societies, and sometimes have been actually infiltrated by members of these secret occult fraternities. And oftentimes they would deflect away from this type of information. And still today, there are those who cannot accept that such a thing might have some merits to it. And we'll just call it conspiracy nonsense or tinfoil hat nonsense and look away from it and not take it seriously. But this guy put in a lot of hours connecting the dots with a lot of this stuff. That's why it's important to look at this. Now, he's naming some names here, and that probably didn't make him very popular among some of these elitist families that seem to reside within the circles of influence and power in this world. So let's read on. So he says, Yvonne Collins was on the Grand Druid Council. She was a traditionalist. To be a traditionalist means that she holds the view that only those people who are born to families with satanic power and witches in their family background can be true witches. Obviously, the Collins family has a long history of witchcraft if she holds this view. Remember that the leading Satanists feel they have special blood. The top ones feel they are gods. Even Grand Masters may teach their selected children they are gods which created the children. This last statement makes more sense when one learns the methods of this, or state of mind and beliefs of this satanic hierarchy. Going to pause for a moment. Now, he refers to all of this as Satanism and Satanists, but he's using a very broad brush to paint all of this. You see, in their own view, they have much more sophisticated systems. that they use and names they call themselves, but certainly you can see this whole concept of the royal family bloodline falls into place here. That most certainly is a common factor in all of this. They see themselves as being the descendants of Cain in the biblical allegory, in the biblical element of all of it, and therefore they have a semi-divine right to rule. We've gone over some of this in past episodes, and certainly this reaffirms that whole notion. So let's continue on. Yvonne Collins would reject the idea that just anyone can become a witch of any significance by training and practice. The occult demonic power would not be strong enough for a convert to witchcraft. Yvonne's occult name is Legina, which means Lucifer's bride. Legina, or Yvonne Collins, who lived in Virginia, got upset with Jerry Falwell. He didn't follow orders well enough. She got the Security and Exchange Commission to investigate his church, which caused the church economic hardships. Going to pause for a moment here. So now this is the claim being made by Springmeier. I don't know if this is true or not. This is an allegation being made. I don't know what evidence he has to support that claim. Maybe there's something there, maybe there's not. But this all adds to the whole mystique of this Collins elite. You see, she had inroads to the Security and Exchange Commission, and because one of their little puppets didn't follow orders, they set him up. That's what the claim is here. Let's continue. Even mainline Christian ministers are expected to follow directives of the Grand Druid Council, which is said to operate under the orders of the Rothschilds. Everyone who was high up in the Illuminati and are now Christians remember Tom Collins. Collins was in the Illuminati, but for some reason the Lord changed his heart and he began to talk to churches about what is really going on. He had an itinerary of churches to speak to, of which a Baptist church was one. He warned what was going on. He was gunned down in a grocery store parking lot and has been used as an example by the Illuminati to anyone else who dares utter a word. Remember Tom Collins, they warn people in the covens. And I'm going to pause for a moment here. Now, how Springmeier could know this, I don't know. Maybe this really did happen. Maybe that is the case. I don't doubt that this Tom Collins guy was probably gunned down in a grocery store parking lot, and maybe he did talk on the church circuits. There were a couple of those guys that were going around talking on the church circuits at those times about this stuff. Now, was this all part of the plan or contrived, or were they really ones that had proverbially seen the light about what was going on and what these organizations were about and had a change of heart and decided to go out and blow the whistle? I don't know. Don't have the answers to all of that, but you hear about this, and this was something that happened quite a bit during that time frame. For some reason or another, many of these people who were involved in these Illuminati cults, when they finally got out of there, they decided the best place to inform about this was the Christian church, which was probably a mistake in hindsight for a lot of them. Because, first of all, the Christian church is very far removed and disconnected from any of these occult-type topics. Let's be honest about it. The modern church knows next to nothing about some of these things and wants to know next to nothing about it. In fact, they look at it with fear and repugnance. Whenever anything occult turns up, they think that they should not look at it, should not touch it, should not discuss it. They think it's evil, and that's that. And that is the worst place to be if you are ignorant of your enemy's tools and tactics and how he operates. Well, you are setting yourself up for a big-time failure. And I think many of these early whistleblowers, if you want to call them that, learned that the hard way. especially in the mainline Christian churches. A lot of this stuff may be a little bit of a curiosity for some of the parishioners there, but they don't want to actually do anything about it. They don't want to have to confront evil at their doorstep. So they shrug it off, think of it as a fanciful story, and maybe a test. Maybe there's something true to it, maybe there's not. But by and large, they don't want to get involved. So they walk away from it. So who really will help these people? And that's a lot of the problem. They had nowhere to turn for help. And it's still that way today for anybody who gets messed up in these high levels of occultism. There's very few places to turn. Very few people who will actually help or believe your story, even, if that's the case. And I think a lot of them had this going on. So maybe this Tom Collins guy was one of them, and maybe he wasn't. And we're going to see a little later there is another name in the Collins bloodline that came out a little bit more famously than Tom Collins in the late 1970s and was speaking about a lot of this stuff back then in the churches. But we'll get to that shortly. Let's continue on. Now, Springmeyer says this reminds him of another incident which happened to a brother in Olympia, Washington, the capital of Washington. 2 weeks after Reagan was elected, a beautiful Mercedes pulled up to where this Christian brother was working. The guy who got out was obviously rich. His suit had to be in the neighborhood of $800. Going to pause for a moment. So that was pretty wealthy for back in the 1990s or back in the 1980s at the time when he's talking about here, back at 1980. That was an expensive suit. And his wife had fox furs around her neck. They said their son was going to work for the state and they wanted to look for a home for him. The woman was being independent and said, quote, "I don't want to go see the houses. I want to talk to this nice man," end quote. The houses were done by Donahue Construction. The men went on to look at the houses, and the woman remained behind and talked. This Christian is an easy talker with people. He struck up a conversation naturally. He said, "I think it's great Ronald Reagan got elected. He's going to be a good president." The woman replied, "We wanted George Bush to get it." "Who's we?" the Christian asked to this rich lady, who kept tossing her furs back and forth. "The Illuminati," she said. "We're the enlightened ones, and George Bush was trained by us." Unfortunately, the men had just returned at this point and were entering the room. The man with the expensive suit was livid. "Shut your mouth," he yelled. She huffed back, "Well, if you insist." He then turned to the Christian, who he didn't know, and politely told him that they had failed to find anything that suited them. "Thank you very much. Everything else is secure," and handed him the keys. Then he dragged the woman to the Mercedes, giving her hell all the way for talking, and when they got in, proceeded to physically slap her around. This was an extremely rare incident. Many of the satanic hierarchy live their entire lives without uttering a word to anyone anything about the hidden satanic side of their lives. As a rule, they find very respectable cover lives in society. The more respectable, the better, to cover their hidden lives. And I'm going to pause for a moment. This is also one of the central tenets of the belief systems of these people. They believe that their good deeds can outweigh their bad deeds, and that if they do, they'll be fine. The karmic principle, which is oftentimes why many of the uttermost scumbags of the world are philanthropists. But let's read on. The satanic rituals are always memorized. You will not walk into these people's houses and find incriminating books or objects. Remember Ted Bundy in last issue's article. Once again, he's referring to one of the articles he had written prior. Ted was exactly the model of how many of the top Illuminati are. They are capable of the most horrendous things, but to everyone who know them, they are the most likable, intelligent, normal people. People who knew Ted Bundy had no idea what he was doing in secret. The satanic hierarchy and their Satanism is clearly the most secret religion in the world. They are a priesthood that rules the world through political leaders that they place in power. And because of their power, they have the ability to suppress a great deal of the publicity that could arise from their numerous activities. To describe the security methods employed to keep high-level Satanism secret could take an entire book. Gonna pause for a moment here. Now, he refers to it as high-level Satanism, and he's not incorrect. It is Satanism in its purest form, and that would be the inversion principle. You see, these people, they see themselves as being a little more sophisticated than that, but Springmeier's Christian bias is shining through, and he refers to all of them as Satanists or satanic. And this is an interesting juxtaposition because, like I said, he's not wrong, but this is not how they would identify themselves. In fact, many of them would laugh at that notion. They think they are anything but Satanists. They don't see themselves as such. But clearly, that's just a matter of semantics, isn't it? But let's continue on. So he says, let's just put it this way. If you were a billionaire, which several of the leading Olympians... Gonna pause. He uses the term Olympians because this is how they refer to themselves, ladies and gentlemen. And that would be, he says in parentheses, King Illuminati. That's what the Olympians are. They are the high-level Illuminati influencers in the world. So he says, if you were a billionaire, which several of the leading Olympians are, what kind of security could you afford? And what kind of clout would you have with national governments and police forces to get even governments to provide security for you? Remember, these people own the press and the media. And I would just cite a more recent or modern example as to what he's saying here. Seems good old Elon Musk has a lot of influence as of late, doesn't it? Interesting to keep that stuff in mind, isn't it? You know, Elon Musk, whose grandfather was one of the chief proponents of the technocracy movement in Canada, but you probably haven't heard much about that either. That's a topic for another time, but let's get back to this. So, Springmeier says, they will kill or discredit anyone who exposes them. Don't be surprised if both of these happen to me, the author. That's what Springmeier says here. And he wasn't incorrect. He was discredited, and he was thrown in prison for a lengthy time and accused of a crime that he claims he didn't commit, but that also is open for negotiation and for debate. I don't know what exactly all the details thereof are. He will tell you the story if you look for some interviews more recently. I think he talks about this. But he hasn't really done anything else much since then. And I think it's obvious why. I think the guy just wants his life back without being a spectacle and being a target for these people. He had already done enough harm to them by writing the things that he did write and exposing the things he did expose. And he doesn't want to do it anymore. Can't blame the guy if that's the case. I don't know if that's true or not. I can't be the arbiter of truth in that. I don't know if everything this guy says is on the up and up, but it seems to align with much of the other things that I've found from the secret society groups themselves and the things they say about themselves. So, you have to wonder. But let's get back to this. So Springmeier continues, and he says here, just know this. They can kill the body. They cannot kill the soul. Our Christian God reigns. They also control the CIA and FBI. Gonna pause for a moment, and this is wherein this whole notion of the Collins elite comes in as well. Many leading FBI agents have not only been Masons, but many have been Satanists. The FBI sends out reports which, paraphrased, go like this, quote, far more crime has been committed by zealots in the name of God than has ever been committed in the name of Satan. The actual involvement of the occult in a criminal case usually turns out to be secondary, insignificant, or non-existent. The law enforcement perspective on occult crime requires avoiding the paranoia that has crept into this issue. Unless hard evidence is obtained and corroborated, police officers should avoid being frightened into believing that Satanists are performing criminal ceremonies requiring investigation. An unjustified crusade against such activity could result in wasted resources, unwanted damage to reputations, and disruption of civil liberties. End quote. This type of thing is hilarious to hear from the FBI, for those who know how they have trampled on every civil liberty by investigating tens of thousands of organizations simply because they oppose the establishment and ruin the reputations of many people. Martin Luther King, for instance. People who have read my book, this is Springmeier speaking, have picked up that J. Edgar Hoover was a 32nd degree Mason, a homosexual, and worked intimately with the Illuminati. For those who haven't come out of Satanism, one way to explain to people how satanic secrecy functions is to compare these satanic families with the mafia families. Individuals in these families learn what they need to know, no more. I'm going to pause for a moment. Now, this portion of what he's saying is true, so whether you want to call it satanic secrecy or not, it's all a matter of just what you want to label this. Like I said, these people view themselves as being a little more sophisticated than that, but from the vantage point of Springmeier, from the Christian point of view, it is satanic, and he does compare them to the mafia. And this is not an incorrect assertion to make here, because the mafia and the intelligence agencies and all of these secret society groups, they all get their methodologies from the secret society groups. That is the model that is followed in all of these groups. Let's read on. The top bosses have cover jobs and give their orders orally. Actually, the comparison between Mafia or Costa Nostra families and Moria or Illuminati families is quite fitting because they tie in organizationally and were created by the same occult stream of secret societies that Satan has been running. And I'm going to pause for a moment there, and Springmeier is 100% spot on with that. That's what I was just saying. And we notice something else. He refers to them as Moria. That's another name that the Illuminati call themselves, Moria. Another insider term that you will see crop up in some of these different things. But let's read on here. Don't expect to find what you are reading here about the Collins family, that they are one of the very top Illuminati families, even more powerful than the Rothschilds anywhere else. People are getting the inside story for the first time. Gonna pause for a moment. So now Springmeier claims to be the one blowing the whistle on this Collins elite. Nobody really knew much about them because we are handed these various names that we associate with the circles of power in this world. Rothschild, Rockefeller. They're the scapegoats. They're put out there in front of people and paraded around by some of these more obscure family bloodlines to take the brunt of the blame for many of the things that these people have done. It's all part of their deep cover. So Springmeier called out this Collins elite as being a very powerful group within the occult fraternities. And I don't think he's wrong. And this is how they came to be known to be attached with the military-industrial complex and the inner workings of the compartmentalized programs therein. Let's read on. So Springmeier says he's grateful for various ex-insiders that gave him accounts of secret meetings. Except for the testimony of eyewitnesses, there is little evidence of what happens at hierarchy meetings. There are numerous clues, but they are rejected by most people who refuse to accept that the satanic hierarchy exists. Gonna pause for a moment. He's not wrong. Even though there's a lot of circumstantial evidence And even though we have a lot of these testimonies that sound similar from people who have no connection one to another, who claim to have come from the inside of this, you can't prove it, and that's the problem. There's no way to prove it because of the modus operandi of these groups, how they function, the things that they do. Oftentimes, the instructions or the information is conveyed orally from teacher to student in an unbroken line of succession. And it is often done so in secret. So how do you prove a secret conversation between two people, or disprove a secret conversation between two people? It's very difficult. And that's why convincing people that something like this actually exists and happens is a very difficult thing. Even though you can show in their own writings of the secret society groups, this is how they claim to function, this is what they claim to do. Now, in recent months, I've had a lot of butthurt Masons send me nasty notes, telling me things like, claims are not evidence. Oh, really? Well, there is evidence, it's circumstantial evidence, that back up those claims in many instances, but how do you prove that to somebody who's shut their mind to the possibility? Anyway, I digress on that point. But let's get back to the reading here. Before the 1960s and the space program's man had not seen the far side of the moon. But that didn't mean it wasn't there. I'm going to pause for a moment. So now, I don't necessarily like the allegory that Springmeier is putting forth here. So he's claiming that before the space programs of the 1960s, man had not seen the dark side of the moon, but it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. This is a bad analogy here, Mr. Springmeier. It hasn't aged well, let's put it that way. But let's read on. But that didn't mean it wasn't there. The hierarchy are professionals at Satanism and are really pros at obtaining satanic power through ritual, deeds, and worldly power. Their activities are very secret. In contrast, there is a great deal of physical evidence from the coven levels, the lowest levels, that periodically surfaces. Robes, candies made of fat, athemas, altars, dead animals, ritual sites, etc. The higher levels believe that the force must be balanced. One's good deeds must match one's evil deeds, and I'm going to pause for a moment just to point out that he said the force must be balanced. This is their belief, and this does, in my view, lend some credence to what this guy is saying and what he had researched. He did seem to come to some fundamental conclusions about what their inner belief systems were that seemed to match up with what their writings would tell you. Let's read on. Consequently, some of the greatest philanthropists are leading Satanists. The lower levels are not concerned with developing power such as what Satan has. They simply enjoy being evil, and in that respect are rather crude in their exercise of evil. And I'm going to pause for a moment here. And this also is true in a sense. Many of what you would call mainline Satanists, or what people would refer to as Satanists, are this lower level that just enjoy bucking society and being evil for the sake thereof. And it is a rather crude exercise of this evil, and that is how most people view what you would call the ritualistic form of Satanism. Now, you have the organized Church of Satan, those Satanists that came about because of the work of one Mr. Anton LaVey. This organized church, well, they claim to be something totally different. They don't claim to actually believe in a literal God or a literal devil or a literal Satan. They are secular humanists in the truest form, and they take the symbolism and use it in a way to kind of buck the system. This is also a crude representation, but it's a little more sophisticated than what you would call these things that are considered more satanic by mostly the Christian worldview. But at any rate, that is what happens, and that is true. These are the lower levels of these occult fraternities. Let's read on, and we're going to connect the dots a little more. The Collins family hasn't received much attention. Who do you think of when you think of the Collinses? Joan Collins? She was a beautiful Jewish Hollywood actress from England. Joan's grandmother lived at Brighton, England, and Joan mentions that her father being a Jew. On page 13 of her autobiography, Joan Collins, Past Imperfect. Her father, Joe Collins, and his friend Lord Lou Grade had an acting company. Joe Collins, his father, Will Collins, and his wife, a can-can dancer, Henrietta Collins, were also into acting. In the 1970s, she was in several horror movies and picked up the title Queen of the Horror Films. In 1977 and 1978, Joan was nude in 2 sexy films, not her first, which were expected to do better at the box office than they did. Neither of the titles of these films bears repeating. One was based on a sexy book Joan's sister wrote that was a bestseller in England. Joan was the first old woman to be in the buff in Playboy in December of 1983. The issue is a collector's item. In her 40s, she was still posing in the buff, which, according to her autobiography, she feels comfortable doing. And then Springmeyer adds, I wonder if being exceptionally beautiful and a sex symbol for millions makes it easier to pose nude. For those who watch Dynasty, you'll likely remember her. For those who watched Hansel and Gretel, Joan was the witch. She was the woman in the film The Devil Within Her. In December 1982, Joan was asked to be the mistress of ceremonies at Prince Albert Hall before the Queen and His Royal Highness Prince Philip. Besides knowing that she's into astrology, after looking at her autobiography, I don't pick up a hint of any religiousness. Besides her amazing beauty, her lack of morals made her a perfect fit for Hollywood. Among her many friends, she had Sammy Davis Jr. and Jane Mansfield as friends or acquaintances, both of whom are publicly known to be Satanists. Gonna pause for a moment, and that was true. They both belonged to Anton LaVey's Church of Satan. She rubbed shoulders with Henry Kissinger. Joan Collins vacationed in the winter at St. Moritz, which is an exclusive ski resort of the international set where Joan rubbed shoulders with Nearchos and Aristotle Onassis. And it says in parentheses, these are kings within the Illuminati. These people were part of the Olympians. Joan Collins spent time with Edgar Bronfman. The Bronfman family are the Jewish Illuminati family that runs Canada. Gonna pause for a moment. The Bronfmans. Wasn't one of them in recent years just accused of being part of a major sex trafficking ring or some such thing? And are these not the ones that own Seagram's and many other large corporations? The Bronfmans, another important family here. Joan Collins may not be part of the Illuminati Collins family, but if she isn't, she has at least associated with some of the top Illuminati. Joan was married several times, but obviously preferred her maiden name. Another famous Collins is Michael Collins, who was one of the 3 astronauts on the Apollo 11. Apollo 11 was the first officially announced visit by man to the moon. Gonna pause for a moment here. Michael Collins. Now, I don't know if he necessarily had a connection to this Collins elite, but he was an astronaut and a Freemason. And he was one of the first to allegedly walk, well, he didn't walk on the moon, but visit the moon, fly to the moon. Allegedly. There are a number of very strange things about that flight and about what NASA has been doing. Buzz Aldrin is a Freemason. Neil Armstrong has gone into seclusion, shunning any publicity. As Michael Collins puts it, Neil has dropped out and doesn't sell the NASA program. Gonna pause for a moment. So now you understand. Neil Armstrong, very early on, he shut down after all of this. He kept his mouth shut. He did not talk about this, but something is not on the up and up with what they did. So it also says here, there's a book written that's titled Carrying the Fire by Michael Collins. The title to his book is based on Greek mythology, no kidding. The god Apollo carried fire, which is what Michael felt described Apollo 11. So now Springmeier says he doesn't think this Michael Collins has a connection necessarily to the Collins elite Illuminati family. But it seems to me if he wrote a book called Carrying the Fire, he certainly understands the symbology of the secret schools. He was known to be a Freemason. So you do the math. You come to your own conclusion about that. So let's continue. So then Springmeier says what our government has been doing with NASA, flying saucers, and a manned lunar base is beyond writing about in this article. Going to pause for a moment. So Springmeier may have known some inside information. Maybe not. Maybe it's speculation on his part. We're not going to touch that right now because that goes beyond the scope of this program right now. But certainly, if there is, as claimed by guys like Luis Elizondo, within the auspices of the military-industrial complex, especially around this flying saucer notion or program out there, as is claimed, then would it not make sense that maybe this Collins elite had an inside track on something more to do with the moon and the space program? Especially since they had one of their own as one of the Apollo 11 astronauts. Interesting things to ponder. So then Springmeier goes on to say, but the question did naturally come to my mind, could Michael Collins be related to the Illuminati Collins family? Let's see what Springmeier thinks about this. Michael Collins writes about himself, quote, fortunately, I have been a poor student all of my life, and my parents, concealing their disappointment, seldom pushed me, end quote. It certainly seems like such a student would need some pull up to get into West Point. Michael Collins also sits on the board of directors of the Illuminati's Rand Corporation, which works with Tavistock Institute. He is not even a nominal Christian as far as I can tell. He states dryly that, no, he did not find God when he went to the moon. It looked like the clues were leading in the direction that he might be part of the elite, when I could come across one sentence that changed my mind. And this is the sentence that changed the mind of Springmeier about his involvement, despite all of this other circumstantial evidence. He says Michael Collins wrote, quote, I feel just as thankful today that I live in the United States of America as I did before flying in space, and I have no desire for this country to merge into a United States of the world, end quote. So now, because Collins espoused this opinion that he wouldn't necessarily like there to be a one-world government, this is what changed Springmeier's mind about his connection to this elite family. And maybe he was being disingenuous with this. I don't know from the context of the quote and where it comes from. It comes from his own book. But that gave enough pause to Springmeier to reconsider maybe this guy isn't involved in some way. I don't know. You could make of that what you will. But anyway, he says, by the way, Michael Collins wrote his own book in contrast with so many of the Christian authors like Pat Robertson's New World Order and some of Billy Graham's books, which are written by others with the big name tacked on to sell it. If anyone could promote internationalism or one world government without any suspicion, it would be Michael Collins, for few men share his experience of seeing the tiny earth in the vastness of the hostile universe, and yet he doesn't. He simply advocates that humans learn to cooperate to solve our problems, which we certainly need to do. Michael Collins has some really interesting and, in a sense, inspiring things to say about what seeing the Earth from way out in space meant to his life. What he writes bears repeating. I don't have the space for it all, but I will share one idea that is novel. Now remember, this is Springmeier's opinion of what Michael Collins had written. Let's see what he wrote here. Quote, "Seeing the Earth from a distance has changed my perception of the solar system as well. Ever since Copernicus's theory that the Earth was a satellite of the Sun instead of vice versa gained wide acceptance, men have considered it an irrefutable truth, yet I submit that we still cling emotionally to the pre-Copernican or Ptolemaic notion that the Earth is the center of everything. The sun comes up at dawn and goes down at dusk, right? Or as the radio commercial describes sunset, when the sun just goes away from the sky. Baloney. The sun doesn't rise or fall, it doesn't move, it just sits there and we rotate in front of it. Well, dusk means we have turned 180 degrees and are being carried into the shadow zone. The sun never goes away from the sky. It's still there sharing the same sky with us. It's simply that there is a chunk of opaque earth between us and the sun which prevents our seeing it. Everyone knows that, but I really see it now." End quote. So what do you make of that? Do you make of that quote the same thing Springmeier made of it back in 1993? With hindsight now, do you think Springmeier still thinks that? I don't think so. I think that kind of reaffirms for me that this guy is one of these Collins elites, one of the family, the Illuminati family. So even though Springmeier at the time didn't seem to think that might be the case based upon some of the opinions that Michael Collins allegedly espoused, it seems to me that that doesn't necessarily make it any less probable that he is part of this family bloodline, especially since he has the last name. He's a known Freemason. He uses the symbolism in his very words here, even. He uses the symbolic language. I don't think Springmeier had a firm grasp of this secretive language at that point, the language of symbology, or maybe a very base understanding of it or conception of it. So who knows? Anyway, he does go on to say here that Michael Collins himself is not an internationalist. The Collins family is an old New England family. Early members of it were Francis, Edward, and John. Part of the satanic branch may live in England, too. Like most top Illuminati families, the Collins have spread all over, so that even the West Coast has some members of this satanic bloodline. Part of the family is both related to aristocracy and to witchcraft. For instance, Springmeier says, he has a complete list of all people accused of witchcraft in New England in the 17th century, which includes some of the Collinses. The 17th century was the first century the British settlers, mostly Puritans, some of whom are also known as Pilgrims and Congregationalists, settled in New England. In 1640, in Aquaday, Massachusetts, a Collins was accused of witchcraft. In 1653, Jane Collins was accused of witchcraft in Lynn, Massachusetts, and a Collins family lived in the Salem, Massachusetts area of Marblehead during the 1650s when the witch trials occurred. They were neighbors to the family accused of witchcraft. Interestingly, some of the last names of other people accused of witchcraft in early colonial Massachusetts include Young, Bailey, Carrington, Godfrey, Hall, Brown, and Clinton. You will find all of these last names on people today who are connected to the satanic hierarchy or the Illuminati and or Satanism. However, the worst example of dealing with witchcraft, the Salem witch trials, was instigated by the Collins family to destroy Christians. Christians have been held accountable for something the Collins family did to Christians in Salem, Massachusetts. Now, this is wherein Springmeier gives his opinions here. He says his opinion is that the Collins family practiced witchcraft before coming to New England in the 17th century. One ex-Illuminati member who was from the Collins bloodline stated that the Collins family brought witchcraft from England to America. For the first part of the 1700s, one of the British Collins was prominent for his books promoting deism against Christianity. As an example of some of their aristocratic ties, Arthur Collins' 9-volume reference work called Collins's Peerage of England, published in 1812, was a definitive work on aristocratic peerage. Obviously, Arthur Collins had a great deal of clout to be able to research such a massive work on people of significance in England. The Collins family gave us John Collins, the 3rd governor of Rhode Island. John Collins was born to the rich, powerful part of the Collins family at Newport, Rhode Island. John Collins, who lived from 1717 to 1795, played an important part in the creation of our federal government and a role in one of the most remarkable court cases called Trevitt versus Whedon, which set the precedent in court which allowed courts to declare legislative enactments unconstitutional. He advocated the issuance of paper currency and a strong central government, which made him unpopular in the rural areas of Rhode Island. He married Mary Avery. Another John Collins, who lived from 1775 to 1822, born to a well-to-do Collins family, was the 10th governor of Delaware from 1819 to 1822. Quite a number of Collinses have been well-to-do. The wealthiest Collinses that I have discovered so far is Matthew Garrett Collins, who lived from 1874 to 1925. Matthew Garrett Collins was an oil producer. His father was Oliver Cromwell Collins, named after Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell was the early Mason who was paid off by the Amsterdam Jews to allow the Jews back into England. Matthew Garrett Collins was a Mason. M.G. Collins manufactured silk and in 10 years took the operation in 1886 from nothing to a $2 million business. He was president of Interstate Gasoline Company. He worked with several other big oil men, such as Governor Charles Haskell of Oklahoma. He was trustee for the Drew Seminary. He participated in the Methodist Church. Matthew Garrett Collins' oil operations and friendship with the governor of Oklahoma are very significant. Inside information indicates some of the top connection between the Collins family and Oklahoma, and Tulsa is a major headquarters for Satanism in that area. There are a number of buildings that the Satanists own in the Tulsa area that are used for their operations. Besides Matthew Barrett Collins, there have been a number of other wealthy Collinses, such as Theodore Clyde Collins Jr., who was an insurance company executive banker and president, etc., etc. Arthur Fletcher Collins, a real estate corporation executive, head of some of the financial institutions and a financial analyst. Henry James Collins III, insurance company executive, treasurer of several financial organizations. J. Barclay Collins II was an oil company executive, a lawyer, and a board of directors trustee of a hospital. Leroy Collins Jr. was a banker, a director, or president of some organizations. John Roger Collins, an aerospace company executive, a banker, an economist, a trustee, or on the board of directors, and a vice president of a number of organizations. John Paul Collins, banker, director of Rothschild Citicorp Research Corporation, plus trustee of a hospital, besides holding other leading positions in a number of other organizations. And finally, Michael James Collins, not the astronaut, who has been an investment company executive, plus, to name a few items, president of Fidelity Union Life Insurance, president Alliance Investment Corporation, president of Collins Capital, Dallas trustee, Kira TV board director, and vice president of the Carr P. Collins Foundation. None of these men gave information concerning any church affiliation with the other Collinses. Usually, if they do have a church affiliation, it is Episcopalian. The Collins family also built the world's fastest, nicest ocean-going ships during the 1850s, for which they spared no expense. the Collins lost a number of ships to natural sea disasters, and after the financial panic of 1857, the Collins got out of shipping and directed their attention to coal and iron. They also had a home on Madison Avenue in New York. And it goes on at length here, naming different members of the Collins families and their connections to academia and to corporations and to banking interests and insurance interests and very many other things, aerospace corporations, the Atomic Energy Commission, etc., etc. And of course there was a Jim Collins who wrote books on the occult, UFOs, mysticism, Uri Geller, etc. So there's a lot involved in this family. A big list of this family. But the Collins family also has some other names associated with it that are not Collins. One of those surnames is Todd. And there was a John Todd who came out in the late 1970s and made the rounds within the churches exposing the Illuminati and their connections to the recording industry and various other places and to witchcraft. And the Todd family is part of this Collins family bloodline, according to numerous sources. And Springmeyer actually goes into that here in this book. The Todd family seems to have satanic undertones to it, even in the days just after the Revolutionary War. For instance, John Jacob Astor married Sarah Todd, who had a fair amount of money attached to her. The Todd surname is not an extremely common name until one begins researching the conspiracy and when it pops up with frequency. It is known that during the time of the Civil War, the Collins bloodline went into the surnames of Todd and Putman. So the Todd family is also part of this Collins bloodline. And this guy, if you want to listen to his claims, this John Todd, he made an awful lot of interesting claims about the Illuminati, about this satanic elite. He also did a lengthy term in prison, was locked up for a very long time, says he was accused of something he didn't do, was locked up for a long time. I think he has now passed away, but he's also one that kind of disappeared into the sunset after a certain amount of time. And there is a lot of controversy about his claims and who he claimed to be. You see, there are those who sought to discredit him and have successfully done so in many respects, but you have to wonder how much of what he was saying was true and how much of it could have been made up and how much of it could have been nonsense. But it doesn't make sense to me that what this guy was saying was not true. Anyway, looking at all of that, there's many connections to this Collins elite that cross over into occultism, that cross over into secret programs, inside levels of power of the Illuminati, dark magic. And even Springmeyer acknowledged this, because here's what he had to say about John Todd. Johnny Todd is reported to have converted to Christ on Labor Day 1972, according to one person that Springmeyer talked to. It seemed like the talk that he had with John Todd indicated 1973 as his conversion date, so Springmeyer talked to this guy, and he talked to people who knew this guy. He was of the Collins family, Todds, and at some point after coming to Christ told people he had been a member of the Grand Druid Council of the Illuminati. Before proceeding to tell about his life, let's interrupt to discuss about whether John Todd is for real or not. John Todd has been discredited as a fraud within much of the Christian community. If I had heard all the negative things said about John Todd first, I might not be writing anything about him, because some of the people against him don't have anything good to say. However, this is Springmeyer talking, and you can go back and listen to John Todd's tapes. I believe I posted them on my Rockfin channel some time ago now. You could listen to what he had to say. So Springmeyer says that he heard tapes of John Todd speaking before he heard any negative things about him. So what has taken him years to understand, he went item by item and discussed. Now, Springmeyer says that he's tried to understand what John Todd did to get discredited, and the central issue seems that a tape he made after he was converted had his voice saying a satanic ritual. Now, Springmeyer says he must warn the readers that he hasn't gotten to the bottom of who John Todd is, but he was able to ascertain several things. First of all, even the people who feel that John Todd was a fraud admit he had to have been in Satanism. They simply claim he wasn't as high as he thought. And secondly, every negative thing that has been said toward John Todd that has any substance that Springmeyer was able to hear can be explained away very easily if a person misunderstood Masonic programming. If John Todd, who was who he claimed to be, then it's an absolute given that he had suffered multiple personality disorder. Multiple personality disorder. Because this is part of the training part of the preparation necessary to become part of the Illuminati hierarchy. Going to pause for a moment. So Springmeyer also wrote a book about this training program, this programming motif that goes on, and we've discussed some of this in the past, this mind control programming of sorts. It's dissociative identity disorder is what it's known as now, but MPD, as he describes it here, is multiple personality disorder. And he said John Todd seemingly had that. But if you understood that, then you would be able to understand maybe he was telling the truth. In other words, the negative things which appear to be insurmountable obstacles to his credibility may actually, if people knew what being involved with the Illuminati is like, could have been items actually showing his authenticity. Further, it appears that after his conversion to Christ, he received so much lack of understanding and persecution from Christians that he backslid for a period of time, and he was brought back to Christ by the repeated message, Jesus loves you. The clincher was listening to the man. After having done years of research and hearing someone tell me much of what I learned the slow and the hard way was very exciting. The man speaks like someone who knows Satanism and the satanic hierarchy and knows it firsthand. I have listened to many Christians speak on Satanism, and on a scale of 0 to 100, most of them are at about step 1. Todd, in my opinion, this is Springmeyer's opinion, from the talks that he's heard, rates him at around an 80. And I'm going to pause for a moment. And I would also say that this John Todd guy, he very much knew what he was talking about and was familiar with a lot of these things from what I can see and from what I have studied and researched. So he was conveying some true information, even if some of it may have been false or may have been askew because of his vantage point or his own personal perspective. But at any rate, I think perhaps the guy's intentions were good and he did know a bit of something. But at any rate, I reserve the right to be totally wrong about that. Maybe he was an absolute fraud. I can't say for sure. But it seems to me doesn't hurt to listen to what the guy has to say and draw your own conclusions. He says, people claim he simply borrowed from other people, but that doesn't hold water. I know of no one else who has openly talked about the Collins family. Now, Springmeier says he could be wrong, that this guy may not be legitimate, but he feels very strongly from what he's experienced that he honestly believes that John Todd was just what he said he was, and he had been willing to talk. John Todd, as at the time of the writing of this book, was actually in prison in South Carolina. So as far as the John Todd story goes, it seems that perhaps he was the real deal, according to the opinions of one Mr. Springmeier. And of course, I've looked at what John Todd has said. He definitely knew something about the occult. Definitely. Seems to me he had been involved in some way, shape, or form. But I don't know if all of his story holds water. You can formulate your own opinion on that, but certainly we could see the connections and the breadcrumbs there. And we see this connection to this Collins family that seems to be in high echelons of power, at least at the time of the writing of this. I suspect that may be the case today as well. This is said by those who have researched this stuff and looked into these Illuminati family bloodlines, that the Collins family seem to be one of the families with the most occult power for whatever reason. And that is what the claim is here from Springmeier as well. Like I said, you can't really prove nor disprove it. But I find it compelling that you have guys within the UFO research community, guys who have worked in the intelligence community, like Luis Elizondo, claiming that he knows beyond a shadow of a doubt that this Collins elite does exist, and they have an awful lot of influence and sway within the intelligence community and within the military community, within the military-industrial complex, and within their black budget programs and the secret programs, and they seem to be attached to these compartmentalized programs that operate outside the oversight of Congress and are therefore illegal secret programs going on, allegedly tied to the reverse engineering of alien spacecraft. Or alien craft, let's put it that way. Non-human craft. That's what the claims are. Interesting. Is this another PSYOP angle? I don't know. I don't have all the answers, but it seems to me that there are these elitist groups who have infiltrated into positions of power in this world and have a lot of sway and influence, and they seem to constitute a type of a breakaway civilization, and they all seem to tie back to these occult belief systems and these secret society groups every single time. So with that being said, the Collins elite. Does this group really exist? I think they do. Who exactly they are, I don't know for certain. We see what Springmeier has laid down, and I find it compelling that his books are actually right up on the CIA's own website. If the CIA is taking it seriously, you should too. Let's put it that way. So we have this notion that we have been seeing all of these mystery drones in the sky, another rebranding of the UFO phenomenon. And at the heart of all of that, it's said that there are secret programs that operate outside the bounds of the oversight of regular government that seem to be at the center of all of these UFO-type technologies. And it has been attached by some of those looking into it from within the intelligence community, and outside as well, to this Collins elite. Interesting. So this is one of the connections to the hidden power structure of this world, this breakaway civilization of sorts, where we see the occult ties and the family bloodlines associated to it once again, connected therein. Like I always tell people, it always leads to the same place. It always falls back to the occult. As uncomfortable of a truth as that is, it always, always, always ties to the occult. And we see that here as well. Anyway, folks, that's all the time we have for tonight. I want to thank you all for tuning in, and I'll remind you, I appreciate each and every one of you. We'll catch you next time. Have a good one now. Discover the amazing, clinically proven health benefits of original Tahitian noni. Original Tahitian noni includes powerful antioxidants, adaptogens, nutrients, and phytonutrients to naturally boost energy levels, immune system function, and overall health. Meticulously sourced from French Polynesia, this is the original superfruit, except no imitations. Original Tahitian noni. Visit ATR Health at alchemicaltechrevolution.com. and click on the Shop Here tab for more details.
But we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.